This video, we're going to be looking at 3D Studio Max modeling for Unity. And we're going to be looking at several different things, picking up where we left off last time. We're going to be looking at line extrusion modeling, which is a different way of creating your basic objects. We're going to be looking at setting up your materials in 3D Studio Max. How do you define and change your UVW maps? And then we're going to be looking at sub-object materials and mapping. I want to put different UVW maps on different parts of my objects, or I've got different materials that I want on different parts of my object. Say I've got a box that I want to make look like a window, and part of it needs to have a wood material that's completely opaque, and another part of it needs to have a glass material that's somewhat transparent. Maybe part of it needs to look metallic, maybe part of it needs to look rusty. How do we set those kind of things up? And I've got a project here that I've been working on for another project that we're doing. Basically, I'm modeling up an enclosure. It's a electrical enclosure. It's got a lot of high voltage equipment in it. It makes a bunch of noise. It hums. It's connected to a bunch of other industrial equipment. But I'm trying to model it up and make it look somewhat realistic. So I've got some photos that I'm going to use to represent the front of this enclosure. I took these photos with my phone, and I brought them into Photoshop, and I made this nice little texture out of it from the photo. Wherever you get your reference materials from, a lot of time it starts with the textures, or photos of the textures, or drawings of the objects, whether you've got CAD drawings or sketches or whatever. The more information that you have about the object that I'm trying to recreate, especially if I'm trying to make something look realistic, the more information I have about it, the better. So I've got some photos of this, and I come over here to 3D Studios, where I'm going to start. And I've got the 3D Studio interface. Now, I could have started just like I did with the last project, or the last video, and create a box, and then I could convert this box into an editable mesh, go into my editable mesh, select that top polygon, give it a bevel where I make it bigger than, I make the offset bigger than the travel of it. I want it to look more like a right angle than a true bevel. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll even come back in and zoom in from the side here, and I can see here's the bevel that I made. I'll select the move transform and move that polygon back down, so now it's practically flush with the top surface of my box. Then I can extrude this again and make my cabinet. Once I've done the extrusion, if this isn't in the right place, that's fine. Right now I don't really care how much I extrude it, just as long as I make that extra set of polygons. Then I can drag this around and move it wherever I need it to without having to do another extrusion. Because if I do extrusion after extrusion after extrusion, I'm making more faces. One of the things that you want to keep in mind is that you use as few faces as possible, especially if my Unity project is going to be going towards like a mobile platform or something. So this is one way that I could do this, right? And I could model up my enclosure fairly quickly with this approach. I could come over here, so there's my little pedestal the enclosure is sitting on. There's the enclosure itself. I could do another bevel on this front face, and do another extrusion on this front face. And now I've got the front of my cabinet, and it starts to look more like a cabinet. Another way that I could do this is, especially if the thing that I'm trying to create is not nice and rectangular, this particular enclosure is pretty much going to be a box, so it's quite simple. But if I've got something where, say, I know the footprint of an object, I can come in and I can start with a line. So now what I've got is I come over here to the Create tab, and on the Create tab, I've got this Shapes sub panel here. The shapes only draw two-dimensional vector objects, right? So they're kind of like the ink in Photoshop, or if you've done any vector graphics with Illustrator, then it's going to be that same sort of geometry. And I've got just like I had with regular primitives, I have a variety of two-dimensional primitives that I can start with that are going to create vector splines for me. And I do have a rectangle here that would give me a nice rectangle. But let's say I don't, for the sake of argument, my shape is not rectangular. I can start with a line, and then I can pick, and if I hold down the shift key, it will constrain that line to the vertical or horizontal axes. So it gives me nice straight edges. Then still holding the shift key, and then coming back down here. And then, yes, closing my spline. Now, this last angle doesn't make a good right angle the way I drew this. So let's say I've got some situation here where I've got these two vertexes that don't quite line up. I can select both the vertexes, and I can go to the scale tool. And now by scaling on only one axis and dropping the scale way down between those two. Oh, and I want to make sure that my pivot is located between them. Now it'll split the difference between them, and they line up very nicely. So now I've got my rectangle, and there's certainly easier ways of drawing a rectangle, but maybe I didn't want to draw a rectangle. I would have drawn it the same way, regardless of what that footprint shape might be. If I come over here to the Modify tab, and I pull down the modifier list, probably the modifier that I use most often, because I wind up doing a lot of models based off of the shape of the footprint, and then I'm going to extrude that shape up. And I can tap the E key to jump down to the E's in this massive list of modifiers that I can put. And there's extrude right there. And I click extrude, and now it gives me some parameters that I can do. And once I put these parameters in, I can change it and change this extrusion. I can give it height segments. Basically, I've taken my 2D line and created a new sort of 3D primitive out of it. And really, this was just a complicated way to make a box, but I wanted to show you that there's a couple of different ways of making boxes. Because at this point, I do pretty much the same thing that I would have done with a regular box. I convert it to an editable mesh, and then I select that top face, and I'm going to do a bevel. Move this top face back down a little bit. Do an extrude up to about where I want. Select my front face. Do another bevel. And do another short extrude. And there is my cabinet. Now at this point, it's time to start thinking about what this thing looks like. I'm going to be assigning materials to this, but more importantly than the materials, I'm going to be assigning UVW maps. A lot of the material work I'm actually going to do in Unity, so really don't need a whole lot of Max's material capability to do something like this. The UVW mapping that we're going to get to in a minute is much, much important. So, looking back over here at Max, first thing I'm going to do is assign a material to the front of this. So the front needs to have a different material. The sides need to have a different material. And I want the pedestal down here at the bottom to have a different material. I've got my materials the textures that I'm going to use for my materials are already open in Photoshop. And I've saved them to the folder in my Unity project asset folder where I want the textures to go anyway. So I'm working this entire time. All the files that I save, I'm saving to my Unity project asset folder so that I'll have them when I move everything over to Unity anyway. So when I go back over here to 3D Studio, I'm going to I can click on this button for the material editor, or I can hit the M key keyboard shortcut to bring up this overly complicated panel. This is the slate material editor. It's the material editor that's on by default with 3D Studio Max. It also has a lot more capability than we need. So the first thing I usually do is go over here to modes and go to compact material editor, which is going to open up this slightly more simplified dialog. Up here I have previews of my currently working scene materials, and down here I have the different material parameters. A lot of this stuff really doesn't matter as long as I have different materials on different parts of my object and my UVW maps are set up right. Then it doesn't much matter what my material definitions look like here in Max, because I really am going to do the majority of the work to make it look like a particular thing over in Unity. So I can change the name of the material here. See, right now it's called 01 Default. It's not a very meaningful name. So a tip that I would give anybody who wants to do work like this in Unity is give the materials meaningful names. So I'm going to call this enclosure underscore front. I'm going to make another one over here for enclosure underscore sides. Another one over here for enclosure underscore pedestal. And I may do one more for the top. And I might as well go ahead and give them somewhat distinctive colors. I'll keep the front gray. I'll make the side some sort of beige. Is that beige? What would you call that? More like a mauve. Beige is more desaturated, I think. Whatever. So I've got two slightly different tans. And then, oh, that was my pedestal. My pedestal would be black. Another tip, if you're striving for realism, don't make your colors completely saturated. So in the real world, there's very seldom is something pure 100% stark white, and by the same token, things are rarely pure pitch black. So I always give my black values, or things that I'm going to be using as black in my model, so just a little bit of lightness. And that'll work all right for the top. So I'm going to unselect the subobject components of my enclosure. I'll maximize this view so I can look at it. The material that I want to have applied to most of the object is the one that I'm going to apply first. So I'll put the sides, and I can just drag the material out of this bin and drop it on my object, and there it's applied. And I can tell it's applied because it's got these little chamfers, or those are chamfers in the corners of my material bin over here. But it applies the same thing to all of the faces. Part of my problem is I want to apply each of these different materials to the different parts of the faces here. So I can go into my sub-object mode, and now where I have different polygons selected, I can drag different materials over onto those different polygons. Like I'll come down here. Oh, I don't want to move that. Rotate down here and select all of these. Select that top face. And now I can tell that all of my materials are assigned to my object on their individual faces where I need them to go. But I'm not quite done yet, because the most important part about making this look like a particular thing is the UVW maps. If I exported this model as it is right now and brought it over into Unity, none of the textures would look right when I apply them. There's no telling what they would look like. If you saw them at all, they'd probably be distorted or stretched, or at the best, they'd be distorted or stretched. Probably completely obliterated. Also, lighting wouldn't work right. Your models need to have UVW maps on them for Unity to calculate the baked lighting properly. So if I come over here, I've converted this back to an editable mesh. I'm back to the same sort of editable mesh that I've been working with. And under my modifier list, if I hit U, I see UVW Map. Now there's lots of UVW modifiers, but UVW Map is the one that I want to make sure that I have on here. Probably the one I use all the time. So I've applied it as a modifier to my mesh, and I see that it's given me this little orange gizmo here. That's because I have a mapping type of planar. So the different mapping types, and it's really important that you understand how these different mapping type works. Planar draws this gizmo through the object, and I can sort of think of my texture as being projected through that window. In fact, it's going all the way through the object. If I look under my modifier, I see that I've got a gizmo here. When I select the gizmo, now I can scale the gizmo and move things around. A really good way to demonstrate what's going on with this would be to be able to see the texture that I'm going to use on my object. Now, I know I just said that it doesn't really matter what the texture looks like right now, but in terms of getting the UVW mapping just right, it could be important. So I'm going to come back over here to my material editor, and I'm going to open up this maps folder here. And this is where I assign, in Max, these are called maps or map channels. They're going to be in different parts of your material in Unity. So like my diffuse color, that's my main color in my material. So I can click on that, which will open up this map browser. I want to go down to maps. And these are all the different kind of maps that Max supports, just to show you that we're barely touching the tip of the iceberg with this. But what we're interested in is a bitmap. Hardly any of those other map types are going to translate over to Unity. Bitmaps are pretty much all we want to work with. And then I'm going to navigate over to the folder in my project where I have my textures. Open that material, and then I want to make sure that I want to go up a level, so I'm back up to my main level. I was in this. As soon as I open a map, open a bitmap and assign it to a map, it's going to open this map channel parameter thing here. And I can do things like I can set the tiling or the UVW mapping offset in here, or I can set a lot of this stuff in Max, right? All I really need to do is see what this material looks like. So there's a lot of this I don't need to worry about. So I'm going to go back up to the top level of my material where I set the color and define all these different maps. Now, it doesn't even matter if I want, self-illumination or bump maps or stuff like that. I don't have to define them in Max, because I'm pretty much going to have to recreate this material when I get it over to Unity anyway. So for now, it's just to make sure that I've got my UVW mapping set right. If I click this button, it will show me what this map looks like in my scene. It'll give me a little preview of it. And now I can see that I've got the only material on here that has a texture applied to it is this front enclosure. I'm going to close this. I've got my gizmo selected, so now any transforms that I do don't get applied to the object, they get applied to the gizmo. And as I move my gizmo around, I can see how my material changes on the front of my object there. So this little twig that's sticking off the top shows me where the top of my image is pointed, and this little green bar over here shows me the right side of my image. Once I get it aligned somewhat closely, I can come down here and I can hit the fit button, and it's going to rescale it to fit whatever the piece of geometry is that I'm applying it to. But we should notice that when I did that, it made the gizmo fit to the entire object. But this material, I only want it to apply to the front face. There's stuff down here that I want to see on the front door that's not being represented because my UVW mapping falls outside of this polygon here. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to right click on this and convert it to an editable mesh. So now I've lost my UVW mapping transform or modifier as it was applied. So what I need to do is I need to apply that UVW map modifier, or another one, to just that front face. So I go into my polygon editing sub-object mode, and I select the face that has that texture applied to it, and go back to my modifier list, hit U to go down to UVW map, and now this new map is only being applied to the front face. And once again, it's a planar map. Oh, and now when I click the fit button, it scales my mapping gizmo to just the front polygon of that object and not the entire object itself. And if I want different maps or different mapping schemes on different objects, I can convert this back to an editable mesh, and I have to convert it back to an editable mesh between applying, after I apply every new map. So I bake that mapping into that front polygon, and I'm not going to touch it again. But if I want to change the mapping on other parts of this object, I can do the same thing on those other objects, on those different sub-objects. Say I want a different kind of mapping on all these other faces. And I'm holding down the control key to individually select individual faces. So now I've got all the other faces. Oops, I didn't want to do that. I've got all the other faces of my enclosure except the pedestal and the stuff underneath. Oh, I'll grab the back too. So now I've got pretty much the rest of the enclosure. I'm going to apply a different UVW map to these faces. And now this one's going to be a box map. So just like the planar map took that rectangular image and used that to place that image on the faces, the box does the same thing, but it does it from all different directions. So if I highlight my box gizmo, I can see that it sort of surrounds the enclosure. So if I had a different image for each of these, then they would be mapped completely to each one of those sides. While I'm here, I want to talk a little bit about the other different types of mapping types. I've got a cylindrical type, that wraps the texture around the object in the cylinder, a spherical type shrink wrap, which is a lot like spherical, but it works differently. Sometimes with spherical, um, I can have texture bunching at the poles. If I use a spherical map and I'm creating like a skybox, sometimes if I look up or I look down, I'll see where the skybox is sort of pinched together. You see that a lot with spherical mapping. Shrink wrap avoids that, but it also doesn't uniformly project. It's an interesting sort of mapping scheme. Sometimes shrink wrap looks better, and then face applies the same mapping to all of the individual faces. It's what I want to use if I want to do like a particle effect or something where I only have my object is really only one face, and I want to make sure that my texture gets applied nicely to that one face. I can just click the face map option, and that would work. That would work well. For something like this, though, it wouldn't work because my entire material would be applied to that entire face, and then to that tiny little face right next to it, and that other slightly tinier face right next to that. And that probably wouldn't look right. So for this, I'm going to go back with box, click fit, so it forces itself to fit as close as it can to my object, and I'm going to call that done. Convert this to an editable mesh, and now it's time to take my object over to Unity. So now I've got my object ready to export. I probably want to give it a name so that it shows up as something other than line 001. So I'm going to name my actual object enclosure. So my mesh will be called enclosure. Unity will create an avatar called enclosure. And that will be its identity when I get it over into Unity. So I have it selected. I'm going to come over here and go to File, Export Selected, and then I'll navigate to the place where I want to export my model out of. If you're working with something like Blender, Blender makes this step a little bit easier because I can just drop my blend model into my asset folder and Unity is going to be able to read it in natively. For most of my work, though, I export my materials into FBX. If I come down here to Save as Type, I see that I have a lot of objects. I can do 3D Studio, which Unity can read in 3D Studio files. Unity can read it in OBJ files. Unity can read in FLT files. But the one that I usually use is FBX. FBX is it's becoming really the game industry standard for 3D model file interchange, because the FBX file contains not only the mesh, but it can also contain things like lights, cameras. It contains the textures that the materials are using. It can also contain animations. I can have only those things in an FBX file if I wanted to. I can have an FBX file that only has animations in it. I could put my mesh in one and all of my animations in another. The whole gamut of capabilities that I need, the functionality that I need in a game engine can be encapsulated in my model through the FBX format. So it's probably at this stage of the game the wisest choice to make, especially if I'm going to use my model in several other projects, or maybe I'm going to put it on a computer where I don't have Blender or 3D Studio. So I'm going to call my enclosure. So my enclosure object is going to go into my enclosure FBX file. Max will bring up this little dialog where I have options such as whether or not to include extra geometry, whether or not to include the animations or the textures. And by default, Embed Media is usually checked, right? So that means that when it generates the files, it will put a copy of the texture map into the FBX file. Now, in this case, I really don't need it because I've been saving my textures to the asset folder where I'm going to be using them. So I really don't need another copy of it in my FBX file itself. But like I said, if I want to give this FBX file to somebody else, say somebody else on my team, and I don't want to have to give them anything else. Everything that they need is in the FBX. So there, it's generated. So we'll come over here to Unity, and when Unity starts up, as soon as I give it the focus, it's going to recognize that there's a new model called enclosure. Now, one thing you should notice is that this enclosure is laying on its side. Over here in Max, it looks like it's standing upright. That's because Unity and Max have different orientations on their coordinate system. So with Unity, the y-axis is up. The world, quote unquote, exists in the XZ plane, and Y rises up from that. Max is different. Max is based in the world of CAD, computer drafting, so its up axis is Z. So the ground plane is the XY axis, and Z is up in Max. Normally, Unity accommodates for that. When it imports something from an FBX, it'll give it a 90-degree rotation around one of the axes, so it seems like it knows which way to point it when you bring it into Unity. But that's why sometimes I'll look at my Max models and they'll appear to be laying on their side or laying on their front. But when I drag it over into the hierarchy, it comes in upright. Now, it doesn't look let me turn it around so we can get some lighting on the front. And we can see that material did carry over fairly well. And if I look at my enclosure in the inspector, I see the different material definitions for my different materials that I set up in Max. However, they're all grayed out. I can't really make any changes to them. So what I have to do is I come over here to the actual FBX file in the project folder, look at it in the inspector, and go up to materials. I don't have to extract the textures because I've already saved the textures to a folder in my prod assets, but I can extract the materials, and I'll put them in that folder. And if I look down under my textures folder, I see that it's made some new materials for me. And now I can edit the materials in my object. So if you import your model and you notice that your materials are grayed out, you need to extract the materials out of the FBX file into some folder, and Unity will create nice little Unity materials that now I can finish modifying. And this is where I'll do most of the work. I can assign my if I have say normal maps or whatever kind of height map or metallic maps or secondary maps, I can do the rest of my material work in Unity now and get the final result that I'm looking for. Another reason why you don't want to do too much material work in Max is because Unity doesn't know how to import a lot of the fancy material functions that Max has. So things like opacity maps, self-illumination maps, they might not transfer over and you might have to recreate them. So why do all that work in the first bit if you're probably going to have to do it again when you get it over to Unity anyway? So that's about it for this type of material editing and sub-object material definitions, line extrusion. Yeah, I think I'm done for now. On the next video, we'll look at different modeling types, how to create some different types of objects working with different shapes, and maybe even touch on a little animation. Thanks for watching.